I imagine that when I said a little while ago that I was going to give a talk on tithing, all of your tithing questions arose in your mind. Maybe not. One of the tithing questions I hear often is, are you supposed to tithe off the gross salary or the net salary? How many of you ever thought about that? How many of you agonized about that? None of you. There's another tithing question that I often get. Rabbi, are you supposed to tithe if we get gifts? We're supposed to tithe from our gifts. Troubles a lot of people. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. And another tithing question that often arises is tithing relevant now that we're, quote, in the New Testament era? So I thought this morning, since I rarely ever have taught on tithing, in fact, I can't ever remember teaching a thematic message on tithing, that I would address the subject, especially because the Torah portion this morning speaks of ma'aseh, or tithing. And it's a very important thing for us to understand. So we're going to look at tithing this morning. Some of you are starting to get nervous. Don't worry, don't get nervous. You know, I don't look at tithing as anything that needs to be major criticism of people, but I do want to point out, I'm not talking about tithes and offerings, like ties you wear around your neck, tithes and offerings. Some people don't hear well. But what is a tithe? What is a tithe? The word tithe comes from an Old English word that means 1/10 or 10%. It actually comes from a Hebrew word, asar. That's the root of the word tithing, and that's where we get the word ma'asar that we heard about this morning. The tithe was given from agricultural produce because Israel was an agricultural land, and that's what people tithe. That's what people gave back to the Lord. It was an expression of thanks and dedication unto God. Now, I need to stop for a second to make sure that I started the... oh, I did. Okay. I forget to start the video here sometimes. Anyway, let's continue. So it became quite a big deal in Israel. It was not something that was just carelessly done. It was carefully done, as we heard from Rabbi Foreman's disciple this morning. And by the way, did you like that talk? I thought it was pretty good. She really got into some major issues about tithing to help us understand what it's all about. And I thought she did a great job. I liked the teaching there. Well, I have a surprise for you. Most of you think that tithing it means a tenth, right? A tithe means 10%. And most of you think that tithing means that we only give 10%. But I have a surprise for you. In the biblical times, when tithing was a significant part of the life of Israel, people gave approximately 23.3% a year in tithing. There were 3 tithes, and if you add them all together, the way they are calculated, it comes up to over 23%. And all the Israelites did that. One of the reasons for the tithe was to support religious workers, specifically the Levites, because they did not get any land. When Israel went into the promised land, they were not given a chunk of land from which to generate their inheritance, generate their income. So they had no land. So the tithe supported their work in the temple. So what became a practice was that 10% of a person's income went to support the activities of the religious leaders of Israel. Secondly, there was 10% for the poor. The poor people were specified to be taken care of by the Torah through the tithes. And there was a third tithe, or a percentage of the people, gave for kind of a community event, a community banquet, if you will. It's a little hard to understand about that, but all these three tithes added up to 23.3%. So if you think 10% is a lot, think back. It was an essential part of the world of the Jewish people once they were in the land. And since they were being taught about tithing for the second time, just before entering the land, we can gather that it was to be a permanent practice in Israel. Would you accept that? They were taught the tithing principles just before they entered the land, even though it had been taught previously. And you get the impression that as Moses was teaching the people about going into the land, he specifically wanted them to remember this idea of 23.3% tithing in the land. Maybe some of the people say, that sounds too much, Moses, we're going back to Egypt. They said things like that. Anyway, I want to talk now for a second about tithing in the New Testament, because a lot of believers are very confused about tithing as they're believers in Messiah, the Yeshua, the Messiah, and they fear, well, the Old Testament taught about tithing, but certainly Yeshua canceled it because he is the ultimate sacrifice. I'm sure some of you have thought about that. Well, Billy Graham, everybody knows Billy Graham, God rest his soul, he believed that tithing from the Old Testament also continued in the New Testament. His theology was that. Now, he's not the only person to say that. Plus, there were theologians who disagree with him entirely. There are theologians that say, well, the tithing was for the days before Messiah came, and after Messiah came, we just give offerings. Have you ever heard that? It's commonly taught. I disagree. In my studies of tithing, I do not see a direct command in the New Testament for the Messiah's followers to tithe. There isn't something that says, like Matthew 18:6, remember to tithe. There's none of those kind of teachings in the New Covenant. But I have something to tell you. All the people that were there in the early days were Jewish. They all knew about tithing. They all tithed because the temple was still standing. So their tithes supported the activities in the temple. So it wasn't an issue to be discussed. It was assumed because they were Jews living in Israel, in Jerusalem particularly, where the temple was. And they knew tithing was part of their obligations. And I believe it was exactly like that in the days of Messiah. I think tithing happened then much the same way it did before the Messiah came. Why should it have changed? What happened? Just because Messiah came, does that mean all the laws are finished? From now on, after Messiah came, are we allowed to murder? Are we allowed to commit adultery? Are we allowed to violate any of the commandments we want? The Big Ten or the 613 commandments? Can we just say, well, Messiah came, he did that all, we don't have to do that anymore? You know better than that. That's not the teaching of the Bible. Same thing pertains to tithing. So I think tithing took place very much the same way as it did in the days of Yeshua and then in the days of the Tanakh. Yeshua only talks about tithing twice, according to my calculations. He rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees for giving a tithe on all sorts of little things, but not tending to the matters of justice and mercy. Yeshua often was teaching how to understand the Torah and apply it correctly in their lives. So he said this, woe to the hypocritical Torah teachers and the Perushim, the Pharisees. You pay your tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, mercy, and trust, faith. These are the things you have attended to without neglecting the others. Although tithing was never explicitly applied to believers in the New Covenant era, if you want to speak of that, it was practiced, and Yeshua was straightening out the people with regard to tithing, because some were faithful in tithing, but they were not living the ways of God. And Yeshua popped them, he confronted them with that. While affirming their practice of tithing, this act was done as part of following all the regulations of the Jewish Torah, but apparently they were not reflecting the essence of what the Torah was all about. But we see from that verse alone, and there's several others I'm going to read to you, tithing was in practice in the days of Yeshua. He also talked about tithing in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18, 9 through 14. Here's what I'll read to you. Also, to some who were relying on their own righteousness and looking down on everyone else, Yeshua told this parable. Remember, I told you he taught in parables or little stories. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One, a parush, a Pharisee, and the other, tax collector. Tax collectors were not looked upon favorably in those days, just like IRS agents are not today. So the parush, the Pharisee, stood and prayed to himself, "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, immoral, just like this tax collector. I fast twice a week," said this Pharisee. "I pay tithes of my entire income." Not net, gross, he knew. The entire income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes toward heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me. I am a sinner. I am a sinner." The Pharisee said in this prayer, "I do everything right, God." And the tax collector, who knew he didn't do things right, said he was the biggest sinner of all. And Yeshua said, "I tell you, this man went down to his home right with God rather than the other." In other words, the one who was humble, the one who knew that he was not perfect, he was the one whom Yeshua commended. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. Yeshua is teaching about how to live, and tithing was taught, but it wasn't the last word on everything. Yeshua does not commend or command tithing to his followers. It was assumed. He just wants his followers to get it right. Does that make sense? He wasn't saying no more tithing. He wasn't saying, yeah, we have to tithe. It was assumed. It was part of the life in Israel in that era. So Yeshua focuses on the idea of sacrificial giving, not so much the amount, but the method. Consider the poor widow who gave out of her poverty. Matthew 12, verse 41. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into their offering box. Now let me tell you, when people put money into the offering boxes in the temple, they made a lot of noise because the offering boxes were made out of metal, not like our little wooden box. So when people put their offerings, their change, all their quarters, dimes, nickels, and silver dollars and $50 pieces, whatever, in the offering box, it made a ton of noise. And people liked to make a lot of noise. Why? They wanted people to see that they were doing good, that they were generous with God. It made a loud clanging sound. Many rich people put large sums in, and then a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins that made up about a penny. Yeshua called his disciples to him and said to him, "Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she has, all she had to live on." Yeshua understood that even though this widow gave a small amount compared to the others, her heart was more giving because she gave a larger percentage of what she had than all the others. Maybe they gave their 23%. This woman probably gave 99%, even though it wasn't as much money. And that's what pleased God. This verse is interesting because it says she gave all that she had to live on. You know, there are many people today, I'm not saying in here, but there are many people today who say they can't afford to tithe, but this woman realized she could not afford not to tithe. She gave it all. What about Yeshua's instruction to the rich young man to sell everything? You remember the story? This rich young man was setting out on a journey, and he ran up and knelt before him and said, "Good teacher," or "Rabbi, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Yeshua said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but my Father in heaven." He said, "You know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your mother and father." And this man said to Yeshua, "Rabbi, all these things I have done since my youth." And Yeshua looked at him and said, "You lack one thing. Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and then come and follow me." Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. This young man had made money his idol and was not putting God first. When Yeshua said those words to him, it confronted him with his attitude about tithing and offering. Yeshua also spends much time warning his followers about the dangers of wealth and how its deceitfulness can take us away from the truth of God. The New Testament shows that Old Testament tithing, I say Old Testament, I don't use that term much, but the tithing in the Tanakh, the Older Testament, if you will, was encouraged by Yeshua himself. So what's the difference between tithing, giving a tenth, and making an offering? Let's speak about that for a second, because it's significant. A tithe is an amount, a percentage of your income, 10%, and an offering is anything given beyond that, but not in place of one's tithe. Don't get confused. In Bible times, the tabernacle and the temple were not built with tithes. The tabernacle and the temple were built with offerings. It's a big difference. When we decided to build this building, people didn't tithe to help pay this. People donated hundreds of thousands of dollars so we could pay our share of building this building. From our little congregation, over $600,000 was raised for our share to buy in and build this building. Do you believe that? It was a miracle. I just couldn't believe it. It was just like God was saying, okay, these people are going to support this building. And that is why we don't have a building fund that you need to contribute to when you join. The building is here. The offerings that we took many years ago, about 15 years ago, paid for this building. So when a person gives a tithe to Emmanuel, it's used to operate what we do in our ministry. So once a person has given their tithe, you're welcome to give offerings. It's commonly done. Offerings are not a requirement. They're out of your heart. They're out of your generosity, your love. So, while not seeing the early congregation being taught to tithe, I think it was unstated because, as I said, it was assumed people were just tithing because the Torah said to. There wasn't a need to repeat 613 commandments. They were already in place, and people observed them. Instead, we see Yeshua teaching about some of the commandments and how to observe them the way Hashem expected them to be followed. Do you get that? But we do see the early congregation of followers of Messiah giving offerings in very great and generous ways. I can give you some verses if you're jotting things down. Acts 2:45, Acts 4:32-37. 2 Corinthians 8:3, 2 Corinthians 9:6-7. All these speak of the generosity and generous giving in offerings of the believers in the first century. This is not tithes, this is offerings. Even the Romans heard this word from Paul, and I taught this when I went through the book of Romans. Paul said to the Romans, "I'm going to Jerusalem with aid from God's people. For I was in Macedonia, and they thought it would be good to make some contribution to the poor Jewish people who believed in Yeshua living in Jerusalem." So they took up a big collection, and Paul says they were pleased to do it, but the fact is that they owed it to them. For if the Gentiles, the ones in Rome, have shared with the Jews in spiritual matters, then the Gentiles clearly have a duty to help the Jews in material matters. So that was a message that Paul gave, and the New Testament was full of examples of believers generously giving offerings as needed. I don't want to go to the details, but it's significant. sometimes people say, well, I don't have much to give, so what am I supposed to do? I want to just tell you our policy at Emmanuel. If you sign on to be a member of this congregation, we say in it, we expect you to support the congregation with your tithes and your offerings. We don't check up on you. That is something between you and God. But that is what we believe, that tithes support the local congregation, which is the temple of today, if you will. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, and God said the spirit of the temple is now living in believers. So believers have become, if you will, the temple of God. And this, our congregation, is our meeting place, which is similar to what the temple was. So we believe that our tithes go to our congregation, but we encourage offerings as well. And some people say, can we give offerings to other places? And I say, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people like to support other organizations outside of Emmanuel, and I think that's wonderful. I absolutely think it's a great thing. But just don't forget, we at Emmanuel are your modern-day temple. And Emmanuel then should get your tithes, your 10%. But offerings should be given elsewhere as well, to the poor people, to missions, etc. Now, a lot of people come to me and say, Rabbi, where does the congregation send money? And a lot of churches do that. They collect money and they choose a mission to support. We've never done that here, and there's a reason for it. We encourage people to find an organization that they want to support and support it with offerings. Your tithes don't go to them, but your offerings should. So your favorite organization might be Feed the Hungry, or Focus on the Family, or Chosen People Ministries, a Jewish mission. And there are many. The elders of the congregation made a decision long ago that we have no right to tell you where to direct your offerings. Those are between you and God and the organization that you want to support. But we do encourage you to make offerings above your tithes to these organizations. It's a good thing to do. One man wrote these words, and I think this is really wise. This is a Christian guy, Kevin DeYoung. He said, whether the Tanakh, although he didn't use the word Tanakh, whether the Tanakh requirement is a binding prescription or not, I find it hard to imagine that Western Messiah followers who have seen the glory of God in the face of Messiah himself and enjoy great prosperity here in the West, and we have to not deny that, would want to give less than what was required of even the poorest Israelite. This is going to shock you. Statistics consistently show that Protestants give less than 3% of their income to their congregation. The Torah requires 23%. Most Christians don't give more than 3%, not just to their congregation, but to anybody. I'm teaching about tithing this morning, but don't worry. If you figure out your tithes, like in the picture there, she said it's like an audit of your gifts. You see how much of you've tithed, and have you given your 23%? You do that the third year. She said that, and it was a little picture of an adding machine or something. So if you're giving your money and you realize that you haven't quite given a full tithe because somebody just gave you a little extra money, you haven't tithed it, don't worry about it. This is not legalism. This is God not being an IRS agent. God is not coming after our money and going to fine us if we're not paying by April 15th. God is after our hearts, not our wallets. He wants our hearts, and the tithe is a way to develop that relationship. Our attitude should not be on how little we can give, treating giving to God and His purposes like taxes. Are you hearing me? Like taxes, looking for loopholes. That's not how we should relate to God. Nor should giving be viewed as a transaction, as if God is our financial planner who's owed 10% of all of our earnings, but rather how much can we give to help others with their spiritual and physical needs through our congregation. So, There's such a thing as a tithe. In ancient Israel, it was 23% of your income, and on top of that, there were offerings. Everybody okay? I'm sure you're thinking, oh my God. Honestly, when I read this and I studied this, I thought I was really tithing correctly, and I do give offerings to places, and I realized I'm not tithing enough. Not if I'm going to follow the Torah. And should I follow the Torah? Shouldn't we follow the Torah? Is the Torah canceled? We know it's not canceled. We know it's been explained in a different way sometimes, but it's not canceled. All these laws still pertain to us that are messianic as well. Here's a very practical example. I'm going to use our music team as an example. They don't know about this. Through our offerings, above and beyond our tithes, we can do a lot of cool things. We need a new sound system. That sound system that we're struggling with is about, I think, 90 years old or something like that. At least it sort of does things that you would think a 90-year-old sound system might do. We need a new sound system. It's going to cost between $5,000 and $6,000. The funds are not in our budget for this year. So this money has to be raised if we're going to do this through special offerings. Had our people, had our congregation faithfully and regularly tithed over the years, there would be money in our account to just write a check for the sound system. But there's not, and we've already budgeted for 2019? Yeah, we're in 2019. We already budgeted for this year, and it's toward the end of the year. We don't have the money for it. But had our people been regularly and faithfully tithing, the money would be there. So now if we want a new sound system, it's going to happen because people want a new sound system and are going to make offerings towards that. And let me tell you what would happen, from what I understand. And our music team can tell me this. If we have a better sound system, we'll never have feedback again. So when we're talking, all of a sudden, that won't happen anymore. I found out that the sound system that the folks are looking for will keep the worship team singing always in balance. Somebody won't be too loud, somebody won't be too quiet. It will be balanced, just how music should be. We don't want people singing too loud, we don't want people singing too soft, but this electronically keeps people in balance. And more than that, this shocked me, it keeps people on pitch should they slide off pitch. Electronically, folks. Isn't that amazing? I think we'll enjoy listening to music to make sure everything is better with good balance, on pitch. It's going to be great. Not only that, right now our singers have to use a monitor speaker that's sitting on the floor somewhere, and they can hardly hear themselves. So this sound system, right, Konanaya, everybody's going to be able to have a monitor in their ear. They'll be able to hear the whole thing. And that should help everybody be able to do music better. It'll help them to sing more like a team, not as a group of individuals. And that's what good worship music does. It's a practical way of applying this principle of offerings. Because if we want better music, better sound system, we're going to have to come up with special offerings. $5,000, $6,000 will cover it all. So you think about it. If that matters to you, if you think that's good for the congregation, especially when we broadcast our services publicly, we want to sound better, look better, it's going to cost about $5,000 or $6,000, and it's going to have to come from offerings from the congregation. I don't want to stress this too much, but let me close with a couple of points. It's clear to me from the teaching on tithes and offerings that we have a clear responsibility before God to pay our debts, pay our bills. We have other responsibilities as well, one of which is support our congregation, but ultimately our obligation is to God first and foremost. He requires tithing of us. Is that for salvation, folks? No. We understand that salvation is a free gift that God gave through Yeshua the Messiah. But I'll tell you, it is for sanctification. It changes our lives if we learn how to follow God's laws, God's Torah. All things considered, it would be worth our while to learn about this. But let me remind you, tithing is really a matter of the heart, not of the pocketbook. The main principle behind tithing and giving is the fact that what we do with our money shows where our heart is. In Matthew 6:21, Yeshua said, "For where your treasure is, where your money is, there is where your heart is also." So when we are able to give our 10% tithe or more in offerings to God, it shows where our heart is. If we hoard it, it's a definition of selfishness. God wants us to be generous and get out of ourselves and think about Him. It's a practice to learn how to tithe. It changes the way we think. You know that the Bible mentions money 800 times. And in all of Yeshua's parables, more than half of them talked about money. Why is that? Because it is where people get tripped up. When we are able to release at least 10% of our income back to God, our money does not have a tight hold on us because we realize that God is in control of our finances. It's an act of faith to give money to God when you don't have it. Isn't it? But let me ask you a question. Is God capable, is God able to produce money and jobs and income for all of us if we trust Him? I think Matthew says that He has a cattle on 1,000 hills. I think we make a mistake when we live without trusting God for income. He wants to bless His people. So even though the tithe no longer applies in precisely the same way it did in the Tanakh, the Messiah's followers have the same priorities of supporting the temple or their local congregation, supporting organizations that do good things, that feed the hungry, etc., and providing funds for the community to gather together. So, to conclude, my question is tithing mandatory or required? What do you think? Is it a mandatory act? Is it a requirement, tithing, for believers? I'll answer this way. Is it bondage to have to tithe? Is that bondage? You know, the Bible says that believers are supposed to have sex within marriage, not outside of marriage. Is that bondage? Marriages are going to be a lot happier. The Bible says that we are called to live lives that are within God's Torah. And He promised blessing upon blessing if we did. We are not saved by keeping things. We're not saved by keeping laws. It never was about salvation to follow the laws of God. Never. It was about sanctification, how we walk, how we live our lives better. And who does not want to have a better life? All we have to do is learn what God wants us to do, and we will have better lives. There are many practices in the Tanakh that maybe don't make sense to us today, but many of them have been sort of reinterpreted by Yeshua so they do make more sense to us in our day and age. I think God knows our hearts, and He knows that most of us are naturally inclined to be selfish and protective, and we want to keep our money. That's normal. So while, yes, we should be cheerful givers, sometimes we aren't so cheerful. But we need to take the step and actually start giving, because when we do something, it affects our internal attitudes and feelings. You're not going to become a cheerful giver if you resent having to give. So what you do, you force yourself to practice, just like I force myself to exercise in the morning. I guarantee you, I don't like to do that. I'd rather maybe sleep another 15 or 20 minutes. But in the morning, I know I've got to get up and exercise. And as you do that regularly, what happens? It becomes easier and your life becomes better. But you have to force yourself. It's not natural for us to do that. So I'm going to read a little story of I found on the internet of a family. It was written by the wife who was living in poor conditions, a bunch of kids. So here's what she said. The first line in our budget and each month's financial report is tithing. At the top of her budget was not rent, food, or anything. It was tithing. That's not a coincidence, she wrote. Tithing is our highest financial priority. We consider all that we have as a gift from God. He not only gives us our actual possessions, He also gives us the talents and ability to do something with our lives, including earning a living. When I was young, she said, I learned a verse that explains it perfectly. You may know this verse. I'm glad to pay a tithing 1/10 of all I earn. It's little when I think of all God gives me in return. That was her little poem. She said, we expect a blessing. We believe God's promise from Malachi chapter 3, that He will open the windows of heaven and pour out great blessings on us as we pay our tithes. She said, I've been taken back by some criticism and some concern of others. I thought I would share them. She said, it angers me beyond belief that a congregation, this is what people say there, it angers them beyond belief that a congregation would accept a tithe from someone in your financial situation. She got that kind of criticism from her congregation. Her comment, we don't see it as a congregation requiring tithing, but rather as a commandment from God. Tithing is about faith, not about money. The commandment doesn't change depending on your current financial situation. She also heard this. A congregation that sets an expectation of 10% tithing is more about business than about the Spirit. I've heard that too. Tithing money is used to construct buildings, temples throughout the world, to fund programs, and to provide operating expenses for many important and worthy causes. This building, my friends, was built before any of you came here. It didn't cost you a penny. When you join the congregation or come, we don't say you have to pay to the building fund, which happens in synagogues. Often the building is built, and if you want to join a synagogue, you have to come up with like a $5,000 or $10,000 contribution to the building fund. You have to buy in. None of you have to buy in. It's free. This is a beautiful building, don't you think? It's a wonderful place to worship, especially compared to other places we've had to worship. It doesn't cost you anything. So where your tithing goes to operate the building and operate the programs. She went on to say, we believe, from a financial standpoint, this is what people said, do you realize how much tithing is costing you? Just think of how much faster you would reach your goal if that 10% went to pay off your debts and pay off your bills. She said, honestly, we don't even consider what other things our tithing money could go toward. We could easily calculate it, but we have never considered not paying tithing. We pay tithing first, even if it means that things will be tight. Even if the remaining 90% of our income did not even cover our expenses, we would still pay our tithing. Paying tithing is an act of faith and trust in God. While some would argue that our family can't afford to pay tithing, we would counter that we can't afford not to pay tithing. That was this lady's story. And by faithfully tithing, they got out of debt and started to be prosperous. But they had to trust God to bring it about. Every Messianic person is on a journey regarding our relationship with money and possessions. We are bombarded with television messages and advertisements about how we should have more money and we'd be happier. The fact is, it's not true. These messages are a lie of the advertisers. Money is the root of all evil. Love of money is the root of all evil. It doesn't give happiness. Happiness and peace comes from our relationship with Hashem. And it takes a while for us to get that. Yes, everything is a gift from God. Everything. Tithing is one way we acknowledge it. There are 4 G's about this. We get to tithe. It's a privilege. We get to tithe. If you had no money, if you had no income, there would be nothing to tithe. So if you get to tithe, be grateful that God gave you a job from which you made enough money to pay a tithe. Secondly, tithing is a good discipline. Even if you can't give 10% now, it's a good discipline to start learning how to tithe. And third, tithing is really an act of gratitude. It's an act of thanksgiving to God. And we need to be more and more gracious, don't we? And if we do this, when we choose to live a joyfully generous life, we start to thrive financially as well. So here's the key. Don't wait. Don't wait. Don't say, well, I'll start tithing when I make more money. Don't do that. You'll never tithe. If you can't tithe off small amounts of money, what makes you think you'll tithe when you become a millionaire? The great tithers of all time have been extremely wealthy, but they didn't start out that way. They started out with small jobs, and they were faithful and tithed off the small money that they got. And over time, God kept giving them more, and they would tithe that as well. J.C. Penney, who was a Christian, reports that in his biography. He tithed the first dollar he made, and he continued through his whole life, and God blessed him. I want to close with a funny story. It's a heavy message, I realize that, and some of you are probably squirming in your chairs and thinking, what am I going to do to that guy Reuben when we're done with the service? I don't know. But a little story. Everybody knew the roof was leaking, but the congregation kept putting off replacing the roof. Finally, some of the areas of the ceiling started to crumble and began to sag. So they did what all congregations do. They called a congregational meeting and explained the problem. Well, a wealthy, very wealthy member of the congregation rose up, he kind of like took the floor, and he pledged $300 towards fixing the roof. He was a multimillionaire. He pledged only $300 for fixing the roof. Just then, a small piece of ceiling fell and hit him on the head. Somebody at the back of the congregation said, "Hit him again, Lord." Anyway, may God help each one of us become more generous givers than we are today. Would you think that's a fair prayer? More generous giver than we are today, so that our offerings can go to the work of the kingdom here at Emmanuel Messianic Jewish Congregation. If you agree with that, please affirm it by Hebrew saying Amen. Now stand for Aleinu as we close our service.